A few weeks ago, I found myself face to face with an absurdly adorable digital dog on the asset store. I had no game to give her a home in, absolutely no reason to adopt her at all at that point. But I just knew I wanted to do something with her. And while I watched the animation previews, a very old itch flared up again, but this time with a vengeance. Hadn't I always wanted to make an animated short film at some point? Hi and welcome. I hope you'll enjoy this. As typical, I'll be heavily relying on assets for this project, most of which are currently on sale during Unity's Asset Store summer sale. You know how that works by now. Hundreds of assets reduced by 50% with the daily changing flash deals. You can also find my write-up about the most interesting entries in the sale in the pinned comment, but let's get started with what I was prepared to be a total headache for a few days. And a big thank you to the Asset Store sponsoring this video. It means a lot to me. Thank you. For films and visual storytelling, your project outline is the storyboard, and you create it before starting any form of production. On it, you capture every key moment you can think of, like camera changes, who's on screen, transitions, and story beats. I love seeing storyboards of movies I've enjoyed for the artistic aspects alone, but also to see how the end result changed from the initial plan alone. But my own ones? Yeah, they are rough. Like, really, really rough. And that is totally alright, because the only person who needs to work with it is myself. If you ever froze up in this initial planning phase due to worrying if it would be good enough, mark the very heavy quotation marks here, relax. Artistic abilities are not required for this step. It only needs to be readable enough to not confuse future you, and if you think that might happen, label things and write down key points to keep in mind. Time spent on this step is crucial because it removes time you would have to invest once you get into production. And don't worry, your first plans will suck, everybody's do. When starting out, you lack the experience to know which shots will be the key ones, and you'll have to fill in the blanks along the way. I still do. That's how you learn and make better plans the next time. Which brings me to the first element I learned during this project. Don't just draw what you consider to be key moments, but make a list of what you'll probably need for them as well. Mine started out with just images, which led to a lot of figuring out which animations and assets I'd require once Unity was opened, and I was working on fleshing out the scenes. Next time I'll do this, I'll add more upfront infos like this one for myself for sure. These preparations being done, I watched a short tutorial over on the official Unity channel about how to work with the timeline in the first place, since I was majorly rusty in that regard. And they made it look so easy. Too easy, really. I've created video tutorials for about 8 years at this point. Let me tell you, there are ways to make hard stuff look effortless and simple, much to the frustration of those working along while watching. So I'm always prepared to run into issues while following directions. Adding the dog, adding the timeline. Okay, now I need an animation. This looks alright, I guess. Hit play and... what the duck? Okay, this was so much easier than I thought it would be. I had imported an extra asset to control animations because I thought I'd need that, but no, this is pretty much just drag and drop. And it essentially stayed on this level of complexity throughout, really. For the vast majority of tasks you'll do, it is as simple as adding something to your scene, creating something called an animation track in the timeline, assigning what to animate, and giving it the animation to play. Sure, there are a few things to keep in mind. For example, when you want to chain animations together, you need to right-click consecutive ones and pick Match Offsets to Previous Clip every time. I'd love for there to be a way to make this a default setting, really. This makes sure your new animation starts where the old one ended. You can even blend them together by dragging them into each other a little. It does require a bit of a set structure for how you box in your scene assets, however, and that's where I stumble the most. If you are animating anything, drop it into an empty parent object first and position that where the origin point is supposed to be. If you ever need to make height adjustments, you create another animation track for that container and record the changes on it, not the character itself. And once you want to also add something like walking along a spline, I'll show at a later point, the structure gains another level. World origin, character spline animator, character. And this brings me to the first recommendation when it comes to assets. If you aren't able to create your own animations, hey, like me, I have no clue about that whole aspect of production, you'll need some solid animation packs. And yes, multiple, because no single pack will have everything you'll need. A very good starting point here is the Human Mega Animations pack by Kevin Iglesias, for example, just by sheer volume of great-looking animations. But don't be afraid to mix and match. I added some animations from the Sunti Animations idle pack, for example, which has a large amount of different kinds of idols, so you won't have to reuse the same one for every single time you need your characters to do, well, nothing. Their base locomotion pack is a good addition to your toolbox as well. For me, these 3 packs give a great foundation to start from with a good amount of variety. I typically work with Smart Library to sort my assets into neat folders to work with, but that's more for visual objects, not animations in my opinion. I only started adding bookmarks to the folders I used a lot during this project when I was nearing the end of production. Please be smarter. Do this earlier. The asset that lets me do this is vFolders 2 by Kobatsu Labs, which is a great sister asset to vHierarchy 2, just in case you were wondering why some elements in my hierarchy are colored. The first real scene I built and furnished was Arthas, that's the dog's name in this short film by the way, waking up, noticing the shepherd getting ready for work, and bolting out the door with excitement. This was a huge scene, all things considered. I wanted some nice lighting, a few chained animations, and of course, the set itself. Key takeaway here, everything needs to only look nice from the point of view of the camera. Nothing else matters. You'll see that a lot in other scenes as well, especially in this one where the shepherd is walking through the forest. I needed a convincing mountain foresty path, but all it took to achieve was that 20-unit wide strip of a rectangle. I added the shepherd early and gave him a simple walk forward animation to loop ad infinitum, so I could check throughout the runtime where he would stand, what the camera would see, and use that to add elements to the scene. Once you change this perspective, everything pretty much falls apart, so deciding early on what your camera will do in each scene is important. Of course, the style you are going for in your project depends on your ideas, but I want to highly recommend checking out PolyPerfect's Ultimate and Universal packs. If you can't decide between them, get the Ultimate one. Everything not vegetation, human, sheep, or dog related you'll see in my project comes from these 2 packs, from simple small elements like the bench or Arthur's rug, to the city in the distance and the imposing statues on the meadow. These 2 are one of the earliest packs I got from the asset store, and they are so much fun to work with. I use them a lot across smaller prototypes and projects of mine, and I love that they still get updates every once in a while, adding more stuff to an already stupid amount of elements. From all the packs on the asset store, the Ultimate pack might be the best value you can get for the amount of money you spend, in my opinion, since it covers a wide amount of different genres and settings, and combines well with many asset packs from other artists. Which also brings me to another point to raise. Ever heard the recommendation, make smaller games? Yeah, that applies to films and cutscenes too. Back in my seminar, our expectations were about 15 minutes and up. And instead, we were told to make a film of maximum 3 minutes. 3. We thought our prof was joking. 3 is essentially nothing. That's hardly longer than an ad break. What kind of story were we supposed to tell in 3 minutes? Our prof's answer to that was the next shock. Nothing more complex than, this morning I made breakfast. We thought she was joking. Well, she wasn't. My little film took me 4 months and came out just over 3 minutes long. Once I was working on it, going overtime was almost unthinkable because I was learning all of it at once. Storyboarding, planning, writing, voiceovers, filming, editing, post, refilming, more edits, animated infographics, even how to talk to a camera. Stuff I thought would take 30 seconds on screen ended up barely scratching 10 seconds. It honestly felt like I had to fight each second and figure out how to get it just right. That was the whole point of the tiny limit. None of us had done any of this before. She knew we'd struggle, so she kept in runtime to protect us from ourselves. As much as I cursed that film while making it, I am grateful for her hard limits. Just as an example of time investment, creating this initial scene, the one I only spent 2 keyframes on in the storyboard, the one that will be shown for all of maybe 15 seconds, took 5 hours to craft. Start small, not because you will fail or your idea is too big, but just to get comfortable with the process of creation itself. It takes more time than one might think, even if you are experienced in many aspects of the creation itself already. But apropos time investment, and back to this project and especially creating the landscapes. I'll repeat my recommendation for the Microverse core collection and adding Roland's stamp packs and environment presets to your toolbox. I admit it was quite a bit of overkill using it for a small project like this one, but for more than 7 months I've been working and tinkering with this combination of assets and enjoy crafting landscapes with them. There is a learning curve involved, sure, and I won't claim to have mastered it, but I am at a point where I feel comfortable with the tools it hands to me, and creating nice looking sceneries this way is more enjoyable and faster than doing it with the basic terrain tools in Unity. For placing singular elements and having more controls over groups of objects I place, I used Scatter once more. It feels like a great addition to this kind of toolset, because while Microverse supports me in crafting cool landscapes and Roland's presets help me get started with larger areas, with Scatter I can furnish specific scenes with a lot of fine detail. For this project I chose BK's Mountains and Glacier packs, as well as trees from 6 Games' excellent Toon Farm pack. That's also where I got the sheep from, by the way. Lastly, some elements are easier to place via spline, like the cliffs in the meadow scene, for example. While the built-in spline pack is already a good start, I've enjoyed working with Staggered Creations' Spline Spawner a whole lot over the last few months. It packs a lot of ultra-functional functionality. You can see more about it in my recent Asset Spotlight video linked above. Thanks to this being a film and not a game, I can go as nuts as I want while placing prefabs everywhere. So for once, I maximized just about every kind of graphical setting I could get my hands on. Which brings me to lighting. I'm using Lumen 2 for the nicer looking light effects, like for the lantern or the effects on the ground in the forest scene. And while I typically also add Cozy Weather 3 to my projects, I skipped it this time to familiarize myself a bit more with Unity's lighting settings. There are essentially 3 things I learned. The first, change your skybox. It makes a world of difference. I'm using a free pack of fantasy skyboxes in this project, but there are awesome paid ones available as well. The second, fog gives your scene a better sense of depth. If the default feels too Silent Hill, switch over to linear and test if that's more what you are looking for. I'll also recommend changing the drab grayish default color to a lighter blue to mimic the blue distant haze and give a scene a bit more of a lively look. The third is work with adaptive probe volumes. And saying that, and re-recording it multiple times, almost takes longer than implementing them. In short, they check how the light in your scene should look like depending on light sources and surrounding objects at set intervals throughout your scene, and will give everything a much more natural looking appearance based on its surroundings. That was a sentence. Create one, expand it to fit your scene, or in the case where there are mountains in my own scene, I expanded it to only a specific selection instead. Then head over to the Lighting tab and click on Generate Lighting. It will take a few moments, and if your lighting looks off, you'll have to tick the checkboxes of your objects to contribute to global illumination. That's easier to do in your project view instead of your scene view. For example, I went into the folder for house parts, selected all, and just bulk checked that box. Afterwards, bake your lighting again. I mentioned splines before, so let's go back to a timeline-specific part that made me stumble, though less than I had expected. See, there is this one scene in particular, where I wanted the dog to step up a rock and the camera show the meadow. Then Arthur was supposed to hop down and dash towards the herd of sheep. So I had to figure out a way to move him in curved lines instead of straights. I knew I could create a spline in my scene with a built-in spline tool, then assign a spline mover to my character, define a length, and done. But this was something that was supposed to happen after other animations had already ran their course. That's where signal tracks come in handy. I can define a signal to, I guess light is the term, and give it a signal receiver to notify. Once the signal happens, the spline animator jumps into action. You'll only be able to see this in action during play mode, however, which I wish wouldn't be the case. It made fine-tuning things a lot harder. I later chopped up the sequence into 2 parts, Arthur's 1 looking and jumping, then being disabled while Arthur's 2 at the foot of the stone is being enabled and starts straight into the dashdown. The camera transition hides the switch from one dog to the other. Which also brings me to something stupidly obvious, which I had ignored for most of the production up to this specific point, which made me curse at myself profoundly when I noticed it. The short film I was creating was going to play during play mode. Everything I can add to a scene that plays during play mode when creating a game will play when I play my scene when I create a short film, because it is still Unity. Yeah, as mentioned, heavy cursing was involved. Have you ever missed the forest for the trees to this degree? Please let me know in the comments. I'm not alone in this. Please. After spending almost a day fine-tuning this stupid spline to sit at just the right height, to not let my dog vanish into the terrain, because of course I had to make this a slope terrain, why be easy on myself, I just attached a small script to him that made sure he'll stick to the ground just right. I'm quite sure there are better ways, most likely something about working with IK, but I was running out of time here, and this project already taught me a lot. I'll add it to the list of useful things to learn about for future me. Finally, I had all my scenes in order, and while my perfectionist side, that just won't shut up, still argues about parts of the final result not measuring up to my expectations, I'd argue the end result is a cute short film about a dog's small adventure in a much bigger world. And in the end, that was what I set out to create. I once read a book by Ed Catmull from Disney and Pixar, who said a movie is never done, it just gets released. You can endlessly try to optimize and perfectionize what you have, but at the end, you'll have to get it out the door in front of people. And before we'll have a look at the final result, if you enjoyed this video so far, I'd appreciate a like and would love to read your comment. Maybe you've worked with the timeline before, maybe even made a cutscene or a whole film. And I also typically make Unity tutorials that are a bit less freeform than this, so if you'd enjoy those, consider subscribing. Unity's timeline tool surprised me by how simple it was to use. Sure, you'll still have to know your basic way around Unity to get the most out of it, but it is a lot simpler to use than I had expected, and there was not a single big, how do I do this moment in the whole process. If you ever thought about creating a cutscene or a short film, and this also means things like in-game scenes, intro movies, whole standalone films and such, this system is worth the time investment, and I know I'll use it more in upcoming projects. Which, by the way, will not contain another book for the foreseeable time. And now I present to you Arthur's Day. I hope you'll enjoy it. Thank you for watching. Have a great week.